And now we will address the first Origenist Crisis. The name of the event sounds so intimidating, but it's a paper tiger if there ever was one. Before we tackle the specific accusations that were made toward Origen, it's important that you understand the events which led to the accusations being made. Much of what we know about the event is from the writings of those involved, and the two Christian historians, Socrates Scholasticus and Sozomen, who wrote only a few decades after it occurred. I'll first introduce the three main aggressors toward Origen that we will be focusing on. First, there is Theophilus of Alexandria. Theophilus was the bishop of Alexandria in the late 300s, early 400s. The Christian historians, Socrates Scholasticus and Sozomen, depict him as the instigator of the first Origenist crisis. Second, there is Epiphanius of Salamis. Epiphanius was the bishop of Salamis on the island of Cyprus, roughly around the same time that Theophilus was bishop of Alexandria. Socrates Scholasticus describes Epiphanius as a pawn of Theophilus, responsible for doing much of the dirty work and convening synods to condemn Origen. Third, there is Jerome. When Jerome turned against Origen's legacy and joined these men in criticizing him, one of his most significant contributions was translating Origen's books into Latin. This may seem counterintuitive at first, seeing that they would want to prevent Origen from being read, but Jerome felt it was important to use his skills as a translator to produce an unfavorable rendition of Origen's writings to offend Latin readers. We will also introduce two significant supporters and defenders of Origen's legacy, who we will be focusing on as well. First is John of Jerusalem. John was the bishop of Jerusalem at this time and was one of the key men of power who opposed the condemnation of Origen. Second, Rufinus of Aquileia. Rufinus wrote works at this time defending Origen. He also translated many of Origen's writings and also translated Pamphilus' defense of Origen into Latin to further prove Origen's innocence and help preserve his legacy. Ironically, before the event had truly escalated, Theophilus was originally supportive of Origen and was very good friends with the monks who studied Origen's writings in particular. At this time, he wasn't merely tolerant with these monks, but very supportive of them by appointing some to ecclesiastical offices and dignities. Socrates Scholasticus records that Theophilus had originally been at variance with Epiphanius, apparently siding with John of Jerusalem for a while when Epiphanius had been creating conflict with him at his church. At this time, Epiphanius had already begun criticizing Origen, and when John of Jerusalem didn't humor him, he attempted to replace John with another bishop in Jerusalem. However, in Book 6 of his church history, Socrates Scholasticus tells us the absurd and comical way in which Theophilus turned against Origen and incited a great conflict among Christians over the legacy of Origen. I will tell you right now, if you are expecting Theophilus to have reconsidered his views on Origen after having first meditated over the matter at great length, you are mistaken. Instead, Socrates describes how his change of heart was due to the threat of death over the most idiotic issue. At this time, there appeared many monks in Egypt who were convinced of the most childish and retarded opinion concerning God. They very adamantly believed that God the Father had a physical and visible body. The other Christian church historian named Sozomen says, a question was at this period very popular in Egypt, whether it is right to believe that God is anthropomorphic. Most of the monks of that part of the world were of this opinion and supposed that God possessed eyes, a face, and hands, and other members of the bodily organization. And although every church father taught that God the Father didn't have a body and that he is invisible, they had come to hate Origen in particular because his writings were constantly used to debunk their delusions. So they developed a very special grudge toward Origen. When these stupid men learned that Theophilus, like every bishop before, taught that God was invisible, they were in uproar and threatened to murder him. And so Theophilus forgot the master's words, Whoever wants to save his life will lose it, and chose to keep his earthly life by abandoning the apostolic teaching. He attempted to pacify these violent men by denying his own convictions and, from then on, openly denouncing Origen. Socrates Scholasticus describes how Epiphanius was a simple-minded man, and Theophilus took advantage of that in this situation to use him to his own advantage. Socrates describes how Theophilus at this time renewed his friendship with Epiphanius, and that he then managed it so that Epiphanius, by letter, should convene a synod of the bishops of Cyprus in order to condemn the writings of Origen. He says that Epiphanius was a man of simple mind and manners and was easily influenced by the letters of Theophilus. And he describes Epiphanius as being deluded by Theophilus. Sozomen concurs with Socrates in his own church history and explains that it was made easier to get Epiphanius on board because he had already been harboring much hatred toward Origen. Now, Epiphanius exhausted an insane amount of time and energy into traveling around the world only to ruin Origen's reputation. Later on, Rufinus would mock Epiphanius' insane commitment to bad-mouthing a single man by comparing his dedication to that of the apostles preaching the gospel to the whole world. Theophilus and Epiphanius continued to wage war against Origen's legacy and to stir up conflict with everyone. Throughout the first Origenist Crisis, many people turned against Origen. Socrates Scholasticus explains that some, out of respect for Epiphanius and wishing to appease him, acquiesced to his demands for Origen's writings to be censored. However, there was still strong opposition to this movement, and there were plenty of significant and respected persons of the time who still supported Origen. For example, Theophilius, who was the bishop of Scythia, strongly opposed Epiphanius and gave a very compelling defense of Origen. Theophilius is recognized as a saint by both the Catholic and the Orthodox, and they should listen to what he says about Origen. He responded to Epiphanius saying, "I neither choose to insult the memory of one who ended his life piously long ago, nor dare I be guilty of so impious an act as that of condemning what our predecessors did not reject, especially when I know of no evil doctrine contained in Origen's books. Those who speak evil of these writings are unconsciously casting dishonor upon the sacred volume whence their principles are drawn." Epiphanius had already received much opposition from John, the Bishop of Jerusalem, who refused to ever entertain his request to condemn Origen. John wasn't ready to begin making up posthumous, retroactive condemnations of a man who had already been dead for 150 years, as Rufinus says. In fact, not only was Epiphanius' suggestion to condemn Origen turned down by those present at the meeting in Jerusalem, but they laughed in his face because it was so ridiculous. By this time, Jerome had already allied himself with those attacking Origen. However, along with his good friend Rufinus, Jerome had previously been a student of Origen's writings. It can't be understated how much Jerome had formerly admired Origen. Just look at him singing his praises in the following letter. He calls Origen the man of steel, whose zeal for the study of Scripture has fairly earned for him this name. Would you learn what monuments of his genius he has left us? The labors of this one man have surpassed those of all previous writers, Greek and Latin. And he goes on to say that Imperial Rome now consents to his condemnation and even convenes a synod to censure him, not on account of any doctrinal innovation, not for any heresy, as rabid dogs are now alleging against him, but because they could not endure the magnificence of his eloquence and knowledge, which, when once he opened his lips, made others seem dumb. And in another place, Jerome calls Origen the greatest teacher of the church since the apostles. Also, Rufinus would expose Jerome for having previously gone so far as to say that Origen was an apostle or prophet. Unlike Jerome, Rufinus maintained his own respect and admiration for Origen in the face of the escalating conflict, outright rejecting petitions brought to him to condemn Origen. However, noticing that the wind was changing, Jerome had accepted the petition to condemn Origen. This brought their friendship to an end, starting a long and bitter resentment between the two of them. From then on, Rufinus and Jerome would battle over the issue of Origen's legacy in the church. Rufinus set out to make Origen's writings more widely available by translating them into Latin. In fact, many of our copies of Origen's writings that are still around today are Rufinus's Latin translations. He set out to translate one book in particular, called First Principles, and did so by first obtaining the most reliable and authentic copies he possessed. Jerome attacked Rufinus as an unreliable translator, claiming that Rufinus cut corners in his translation. Jerome then produced his own translation of First Principles, with the intention of making it much less flattering toward Origen. However, his version has not survived. And unfortunately, I have noticed that many people today, even those who both admire Origen and Rufinus, entertain a low opinion of Rufinus's translations. There seems to be a common belief that Rufinus treated his translations very liberally, and many claim that he will outright change the books he worked on. I personally have come to believe that this claim is greatly exaggerated and blown out of proportion. Rufinus was merely mindful of the fact that sometimes books, especially those from credible and famous authors, were sometimes corrupted by heretics who wanted to give credence and legitimacy to their beliefs. If you should actually read the many prefaces that Rufinus writes to his own translations, you'll see that he only talks about removing the dubious passages. It's a common practice among scholars even today to leave out suspected interpretations. Yet Rufinus outright denies the idea that he ever completely subverted or altered the meaning of a book. He says, "Have I ever led men to expect that I should put in anything of my own? Where can they find the words which they pretend that I have said, and on which they ground their calumnious accusations, namely that I have removed what was bad and put good words instead?" Although it should be noted that there are people who have acknowledged the fact that Jerome's accusations toward Rufinus are baseless. One Eastern Orthodox author, John Baer, writes, "Despite much bluster aimed at Rufinus himself, Jerome's apologies are, it has to be said, remarkably lacking in detail regarding the alleged errors in Rufinus's translation." However, even though Jerome's public opinion had changed of Origen, he remained indebted to all the things he had learned from him. The Westminster Handbook to Origen writes, "Jerome demonstrates time after time, especially in his exegesis, that he was a lifelong dedicated reader of Origen's works." He would even later admit that his own commentaries on Galatians, Ephesians, Titus, and Philemon were close copies of Origen's own commentaries on these books. At this point, Socrates Scholasticus begins to describe how Theophilus was becoming very ambitious, and that he was cunningly taking advantage of this controversy for his own gain. He describes how Theophilus was using the Origenist Crisis to tarnish the reputation of John Chrysostom, the Bishop of Constantinople. He writes how John Chrysostom paid little attention to the communications of Epiphanius and Theophilus, and then says that as soon, however, as it became apparent to everybody that Theophilus was endeavoring to divest John of his bishopric, then all those who had any ill will against John combined in calumniating him. Things escalated even further in 402 AD when Theophilus violently expelled the so-called Origenist monks from the monasteries of Egypt with the help of many soldiers, setting their houses on fire, which resulted in the deaths of some, including children. In particular, 4 brothers who were banished, referred to as the Tall Brothers, were famous for their strict fasting, chastity, and knowledge of the Bible. Opposed by Theophilus, the Tall Brothers fled to Constantinople, where they were received by John Chrysostom. When John Chrysostom examined these men, he found that their beliefs were orthodox. He even sent a letter to Theophilus asking what exactly prevented these men from being received back to communion. Theophilus, however, never responded. Now, there are many among the Catholic and Orthodox circles who really love John Chrysostom, and these people should know that Theophilus weaponized this moment against John in the future. If you respect Chrysostom, you should know that his hospitality towards these so-called Origenist monks played a key part when he was later deposed at the Synod of the Oak in 403 AD. You see, a truly bizarre turn of events ensued after Chrysostom brought this matter to the emperor. Theophilus was summoned to Constantinople to be judged for his violence and his crimes, and John Chrysostom was supposed to preside over this trial. Theophilus would be examined for his treatment and accusations toward the monks and the Toll brothers. So, Theophilus then requested Epiphanius to go and convince Chrysostom to condemn the Origenists. According to some accounts, however, Epiphanius realized that Theophilus was merely using him for his own purposes, and so he left the capital, being ashamed. But Epiphanius died before he could even finish his journey home in 403 AD. But then, when Theophilus finally did show up to what was supposed to be his trial in Constantinople, he brought with him money and gifts. He then searched for all of Chrysostom's adversaries, men who had been excommunicated by Chrysostom for committing adultery and other sins, and brought their grievances to the authorities. And so Theophilus, who again had been summoned to be put on trial by Chrysostom, had manipulated the situation so that Chrysostom would be put on trial by him. Palladius says that Theophilus had brought about such a change in the minds of the authorities and perverted the majority of the clergy. And then once John Chrysostom had been successfully exiled, get this, Theophilus restores normal relations with the Origenist monks, and the first Origenist Crisis reaches its end. And most shamefully, after everything that he did, Theophilus then continued to read Origen's writings. Everyone was shocked that after all the commotion he caused over Origen, he would then just turn around and casually read what he had publicly condemned. And with that being said, that is the account of what has come to be known as the First Origenist Crisis. This wasn't a sober and methodical inquiry conducted by dignified and honorable men, carefully examining the teachings of a man whose writings had slipped under the radar. Rather, this episode is an ignoble scandal, fraught with bloodshed, threats of violence, cowardice, personal ambition, jealousy, and slander. The spirit that gave rise to this event is marked by wickedness, and therefore the accusations leveled against Origen that arise from it must likewise be seen as tainted by the same corrupt source. Wickedness giving birth to wickedness. We will now examine the sequence of events which came to be known as the Second Origenist Crisis, which occurred in the mid-6th century, and it was at this time that Origen was condemned. However, this second crisis was very different from the first Origenist crisis, because this time the controversy had not really so much to do with Origen, but it actually was over a group of monks who studied Origen's books. These monks had developed very peculiar beliefs loosely based on what they were reading. And those who would later condemn these same monks thought that it would be good to extend their condemnation to Origen himself for having spawned these interpretations of his writings, regardless of Origen's actual beliefs. For instance, Vincent of Lerins says, although there was no error in Origen's original meaning, yet Origen's authority appears to be an effectual cause in leading people to embrace error. But if this is really a reasonable course of action, why do we stop short at condemning Origen for being misinterpreted? Why don't we also censure the writings of, the apostles themselves, whose writings were abused by heretics more than anyone? But I digress. The second crisis began, as we said, in the 500s. The controversy erupted when Palestinian monks extrapolated strange beliefs from Origen's writings, which Origen did not teach. You see, the cause of the dispute was that the monks believed that all souls were originally equal to Christ, and that all souls will be equal to Christ again in the future. These monks became known as the Isochristoi, which means those who assume equality with Christ. In 543 AD, a synod was convened where not only this group was condemned, but also Origen, who was blamed for being their leader. But the thing is, I have left out a very important detail. The texts which were brought forward as origins which were responsible for this belief were not written by Origen. Yeah, most of the supposed Origenist ideas that were being attacked here were actually rooted in the teachings of a man named Evagrius Ponticus. And these people got themselves so confused that they thought that these were the writings of Origen and blamed Origen. The Westminster Handbook to Origen describes the events in the following way. It says, Origen is condemned because he is the leader of the Isochristoi. Objectionable texts are cited. These turn out to be those of Evagrius Ponticus. Later, in 553 AD, at the Second Council of Constantinople, Origen was brought up and condemned because they viewed him as if he were the figurehead of the Isochristoi. In the present-day version of the 10th anathema of this council, Origen's name is found, listed in the last place as one of the heretics they condemned. Now, although everyone agrees that Origen's legacy and history suffered significant collateral damage at this council, and that he was condemned along with the Isochristoi, it's commonly believed that Origen's name was actually interpolated here, and that he wasn't listed in the 10th anathema when it was written. The evidence for this, among other things, is that the first draft of this list of heretics, which is called the Homonoia, doesn't feature Origen's name. And then later, when a bishop who didn't participate in the council finally agreed to sign the condemnations, Origen's name doesn't appear in his version either. This has led many to believe that Origen's name was inserted into the text by someone much later on. And not only is this the opinion of several scholars, but this is also even admitted by some of the Orthodox, like David Bentley Hart, who writes, "But embarrassingly, we now know and have known for quite some time that the record was falsified." As stupid and ridiculous as this event was, it had a very serious long-term impact because Origen's reputation had been so severely maligned, it discouraged many people from preserving his writings. For this reason, much of Origen's vast library has been lost to time, which is probably the greatest crime. These shameless men have robbed the world of a gold mine.